The Dyatlov Pass Incident. In January of 1959, 9 young people walked into the mountains of the northern Ural region of the Soviet Union. None of them came back. What happened to them in the days that followed has never been fully explained. Not by the hundreds of researchers and journalists and curious people who have spent decades trying to understand what happened on the slope of a mountain. The local Mansi people called Kholat Shakal. In their language, that name meant dead mountain. And they had been on expeditions like this before. They were not amateurs wandering into terrain they did not understand. The group consisted of 8 men and 2 women. Their goal was to reach a peak called Otorten in the northern Urals. It was a Category 3 expedition, the most difficult classification in Soviet mountaineering. They were qualified for it. They set out from the last inhabited settlement, a village called Vijay, on the 28th of January. A 10th member of the group turned back early due to illness. He survived. The remaining 9 continued into the mountains. The last confirmed sighting of the group alive was on the 1st of February, when they were photographed setting up camp on the slope of Kholat Syakhl. They had deviated slightly from their planned route due to weather conditions and poor visibility. Dyatlov had decided to camp on the slope rather than descend to a more sheltered position in a forested valley below. This decision would be examined and re-examined for decades. After that photograph, there is no more confirmed record of any of them alive. They were expected back in Vijay by the 12th of February. When they did not return, a search and rescue operation was organized. It took until the 26th of February for searchers to find the camp. What they found there set the tone for everything that followed. The tent was still standing. It had been cut open from the inside. From the inside, all of the group's belongings were still in the tent. Everything they would have needed to survive in temperatures that were well below freezing. None of it had been taken. The group had left the tent in such a hurry that they had left behind the things that would keep them alive. And they had cut through the tent fabric from the inside to get out faster than the entrance would allow. Footprints in the snow led away from the tent down the slope toward the tree line below. The footprints showed that the group had been wearing only socks, or in some cases nothing on their feet at all when they fled the tent. In temperatures estimated at minus 30 degrees Celsius. The first 2 bodies were found on the 1st of March at the edge of the tree line. They were found under a large cedar tree. They were wearing only their underwear. The branches of the cedar tree had been broken at a height of up to 5 meters, suggesting that one or both of them had climbed the tree, possibly to see something, possibly to get away from something on the ground. There was evidence of a fire at the base of the tree. The fire had been small, not nearly sufficient to provide warmth in those conditions. The next 3 bodies were found shortly afterward. One person's skull had a small fracture. The official cause of death for all 5 was hypothermia. The search for the remaining 4 members of the group continued. They were not found until May, when the snow began to melt. They were discovered in a ravine approximately 75 meters from the cedar tree, under nearly 4 meters of snow. What the investigators found when they examined these 4 bodies changed the nature of the case entirely. The injuries were catastrophic. Another had massive skull damage. 2 others had severe chest trauma, multiple fractured ribs, damage that a forensic expert at the time compared to the kind of force produced by a car crash. But there were no external wounds, no bruising on the skin, consistent with a physical assault. The injuries were internal, massive internal trauma with no corresponding external damage. The forensic expert said he had never seen anything like it. He said the force required to produce those injuries without leaving marks on the skin was enormous and entirely outside his experience. There was one more detail. One girl was missing her tongue and her eyes. The investigators noted this. They could not explain it. Decomposition was suggested. The action of meltwater in the ravine was suggested. But the tongue was missing from the mouth entirely, and the eyes were gone from the skull. The Soviet investigation concluded in May of 1959. The official finding was that the group had died as a result of an overwhelming natural force. The case was classified. It remained sealed for 30 years. When the Soviet Union collapsed and the files were eventually made available, researchers found that certain documents were missing from the record. The theories that have accumulated around the Dyatlov Pass Incident in the decades since fill entire books. An avalanche was the most persistent official explanation, but the tent was still standing when searchers found it. An avalanche sufficient to cause the injuries found on the 4 bodies in the ravine would not have left the tent intact. Infrasound was proposed, the idea that specific wind conditions in mountain terrain could produce low-frequency sound waves that caused panic and disorientation in humans. Researchers have documented that infrasound can produce feelings of dread and even hallucinations in laboratory conditions. But infrasound does not fracture ribs from the inside without leaving marks on the skin. Kholat Shakal, Dead Mountain, was not a sacred site to the Mansi, despite what later retellings of the story sometimes claimed. But the Mansi knew the mountain, and they did not camp on it. In 2019, the Russian authorities reopened the investigation. They examined the case with modern forensic and meteorological tools unavailable to the original investigators. Their conclusion was avalanche. The tent had been partially buried, they said. The group had cut their way out in a panic. They had not been able to return for their equipment because of the conditions. The internal injuries on the 4 bodies in the ravine were consistent, they said, with the compressive force of snow. The researchers and investigators who had spent decades on the case were not satisfied. The tent showed no evidence of avalanche impact. The slope where it was pitched was not steep enough to produce the kind of slide that would explain the injuries. The footprints leading away from the tent were orderly and calm, not the chaotic marks of people fleeing a wall of snow. The case remained exactly where it had been for 60 years, unanswered. 9 experienced mountaineers had fled their tent in the middle of the night in temperatures that killed without proper clothing within minutes. They had not taken their boots. They had not taken their warm clothes. Whatever they had encountered inside or outside that tent had frightened them beyond the reach of the survival instinct, beyond the reach of every piece of hard-won mountain experience they carried between them. They had run from it into the dark and the cold and the snow of a mountain the local people had always known better than to sleep on. And whatever it was had never been identified, and the files that might have explained it were gone, and the 4 people whose injuries made no physical sense were buried under 4 meters of snow for 3 months while the mountain kept its silence. Igor Dyatlov was found lying on his back in the snow with his face turned toward the tent, reaching for it, or watching something between himself and it, something that left no tracks, something that left no evidence.